My capstone project will be centered around project-based learning and its general effects on students' abilities to think critically. The project will be centered around students receiving critters, or commonly known as mealworms, and making initial observations and developing questions regarding these critters. They will be then in charge as groups to decide how they will go about answering these questions by creating scientific experimentation that will answer their questions that they want to. Students will be required to make multiple experiments to answer a variety of different questions. Then they will also be in charge of revising one experiment to better answer the questions. Throughout the process, they will also be providing me with digital products that shows their progress throughout their experiment, as well as collecting pictures and information to develop a digital story at the end of their project. The project will last multiple months, so they may see the entire life cycle of their critters, or better known as mealworms. So what does literature have to say regarding my capstone project and its effects? First of all, what is critical thinking? The National Council for Excellence in Critical Thinking defines critical thinking as the intellectually disciplined process of actively, skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and/or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observations, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. Lauer defines critical thinking of utilizing 3 levels of Bloom taxonomy: analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. A little more of a simplistic look at critical thinking. We know that students need critical thinking for standardized testing now. We also know that by going into different industries that critical thinking skills are necessary. Many a teacher will say they just don't think critical anymore, but the real question is, how do we do that? I believe project-based learning is the way to increase critical thinking. What will happen is, by students being able to formulate their own questions and evaluate their own progress, they'll develop the skill set to be able to think critically. By being able to evaluate and synthesize and analyze their own results, they'll develop those skills and be able to apply those in a variety of aspects throughout their educational career. I believe it's very effective to start these types of project-based learning in middle school and develop these skills before the onset of high school. So project-based learning, how does it work? Essentially, project-based learning, as Bell defines, is project-based learning as students-driven, teacher-facilitated approach to learning. Students are in charge of the learning experience. They're developing their own projects, not these standard busy work projects that teachers have done for decades, but projects that have meaning to students, that students are engaged in, they're excited, and they're learning. The 7 essential parts of project-based learning are: they need to know, a driving question, student voice and choice, 21st century skills, inquiry, motivation, feedback and revision, and then also publicly presented. By providing these 7 essential characteristics of a project-based learning, students will have the full gamut of the learning process as they take ownership of their own learning in a unique and engaging way. So what is true inquiry learning? Project-based learning and inquiry learning are very closely connected. We can see that inquiry by Colburn is defined as the creation of a classroom where students are engaged in essential, open-ended, student-centered, hands-on activities. Providing hands-on activities without the open-ended questions is just those cookie-cutter labs. By students being able to develop their own questions and create their answers, they take ownership of their own learning. They're engaged, they're excited, and their attention level is highly increased versus the traditional format of cookie-cutter labs. The essential part is those open-ended questions. Students are in charge of providing and answering and their own questions, not something I've given them. They're in charge of deciding the procedures, how to effectively design an experiment, how will be the best way to test conductivity, what's the best way to test heat and thermal dynamics as seen in the picture. But by providing students with very little framework, they're able to start to begin to think scientifically and also think critically, which is ultimately the goal, because they're able to use those skills of analyzing and revising their own thinking process throughout this learning process. Using 21st century skills on project-based learning is essential. Project-based learning, one of the most difficult parts is assessment, and 21st century skills provide students with the opportunity to be able to utilize these skills and show and demonstrate. Digital formatting is something, a language that they speak, and becoming digitally literate is essential. As you can see in the video that's showing, this is actually one of the digital stories that one of my classes last year created. This is their whole entire mealworm project documented. They used iMovie as the form of digital representation for their project. I also mentioned earlier that my students throughout my Capstone Project will also be creating other types of digital products, such as podcasts, Glogsters, Prezi, and trying to familiarize them with a variety of digital mediums to represent their actual products. Students nowadays understand this. They watch YouTube videos. This is how they think. We see a high increase in the utilization of digital media. We know that it's essential for them as they go into further careers, and especially as they get into high school and college. Understanding digital representation is essential, and it's also the most effective way to provide students with a way to demonstrate their learning in project-based learning. Project-based learning, one of the difficult things is that assessing it on a multiple choice test is not effective. We need to see the students producing something that shows what they've learned, and digital stories allows them to do that with certain requirements of what they must put into their movie and their story, but it allows them to use a medium that's natural in their communication and relevant. The also wonderful thing to watching students create these is the amount of pride that they take in their learning process. They want their digital story to be the best. They want their project to show how much they've learned. And then we also think it's important that students are allowed to publicly show this. This last year with my project, when I did this initially, I allowed students, I invited the whole school and had multiple classes coming through and viewing their digital stories. And the students from all grades were engaged in what the students had done, and the students themselves were very proud of and had a great ownership of what they actually have done and produced. And I'm able to see their learning in a very tangible way versus trying to match project-based learning into a multiple choice assessment. This is a better way to assess project-based learning in a new format of using a digital product. I also think it would be essential for critical thinking skills, because as you go through 21st century skills, you see that it takes a lot of analysis of what to put into the product. It's not as dictated, so they're using a lot more of those critical thinking skills applied into their actual production of their digital story or whatever digital product that they're actually utilizing. Students show their growth through their products, and that's the essential part of using digital products. I appreciate your time, and thank you for your consideration of my Capstone project.